Doncs molt bona tarda. Molt bona tarda a tothom i benvinguts aquí al Palau Macaya. És el tercer diàleg del cicle Una pau precària. I avui deixeu-me dues frases per dir que no és un dia qualsevol. Demà farà 25 anys que van assassinar l'Ernest Lluch. Avui, per tant, aquest diàleg en un context d'un cicle sobre pau i sobre, encara que sigui una pau precària, el fem per recordar-lo i ho fem com entenem que a ell li hagués agradat, que és parlant de coses d'avui. Avui segur que ell estaria opinant i reflexionant a l'entorn de què està passant al nostre món i vam pensar molt bé a qui podíem convidar per parlar, justament per reflexionar a l'entorn de què està passant al món, què és el que segur que l'Ernest Lluch estaria fent. Doncs, per fer-ho, farem un dels diàlegs i l'hem pensat molt i ens acompanyen dues persones que segur que deixaran la reflexió a un nivell molt alt com el que l'Ernest Lluch hagués segur plantejat. Per tant, demà 25 anys i, per tant, un record des de la Fundació, des del Palau Macaya, de les organitzacions que organitzen aquests diàlegs. Sense més, estem al tercer diàleg del cicle. Avui, Geoestratègia europea, principis fundadors d'Europa, mapa de conflictes i escenaris de futur. Per fer-ho tenim a dues persones que probablement no se'ns acut millor persones per poder fer un diàleg d'aquest perfil. Tenim a la Arantxa González Laya, a la Nathalie Tocci. Nathalie, Arantxa, muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos hoy. Tenim a la Nathalie Tocci. La Nathalie ve del món de les relacions internacionals, llicenciada a l'University College d'Oxford. És la directora de l'Institut d'Afers Internacionals de Roma i és també professora, ha estat professora a la Universitat de Tübingen, a la Florence School of Transnational Governance de l'European University Institute de Florència i està ja treballant en un moment de pont a la School of Advanced International Studies de la Johns Hopkins University, de Washington, Bologna i Xina. Les seves principals línies de recerca, com molts sabreu, són la integració política europea, l'Orient Mitjà, l'Europa de l'Est, les relacions transatlàntiques, el multilateralisme, la resolució de conflictes, etc. Per què és molt interessant? És molt interessant perquè ella ha estat assessora dels alts representants de la Unió Europea, de la Federica Mogherini, del Josep Borrell, i va implementar l'estratègia global europea. Ha ocupat llocs de recerca al Center for European Policy Studies a Brussel·les o al Transatlantic Academy a Washington o Nova York, a part de l'Institut de Florència que comentava. Ha estat en múltiples llocs i és comentarista habitual a mitjans de comunicació com a Política Europa. La poden llegir també al Guardian o a l'Estampa o fa les seves aparicions al context de la BBC i té múltiples publicacions a les que no m'extendré. M'interessa dir que té aquesta vessant de persona que està en l'estratègia i ha estat en l'estratègia europea a l'entorn de tots aquests temes que comentàvem i a la vegada té una pota a l'acadèmia i a la vegada és una molt bona divulgadora i ens semblava que, per tant, era una figura que volíem tenir avui. Muchas gracias, Nathalie, por acompañarnos. Y de otra banda tenim a la Arantxa González Laya. Muchísimas gracias, Arantxa. Sé que no es fácil tu agenda y, por lo tanto, muchas gracias por hacernos el hueco hoy, que para nosotros es un día importante. Vale. Arantxa en estos momentos es decana de la Paris School of International Affairs de Sciences Po, a París. Com sabeu, és experta en relaciones internacionales, comercio y economía, con una dilatada experiencia en instituciones europeas, organismos multilaterales. Saben que fue ministra de Asuntos Exteriores de la Unión Europea y Cooperación del Gobierno de España. Antes había ocupado cargos en la Subsecretaría General de la Organización de las Naciones Unidas y en el Centro de Comercio Internacional. Y antes había estado también en la Organización Mundial de Comercio, por lo tanto nos da una visión, siendo jefa de gabinete del director general de Pascal Lamy en su momento y su representante en el G20. Había estado también en la Comisión Europea, en el área de Relaciones Exteriores, también como portavoz. Es decir, vamos viendo ya el mapa. y ella, digamos, llega aquí desde el derecho. Ella es licenciada en Derecho de la Universidad de Navarra y luego tiene títulos de máster en Derecho Europeo por la Universidad Carlos III de Madrid. Lo que me interesa también es esta perspectiva plural con la que llegan al diálogo y la generosidad que tienen siempre de, aparte de estar en sus clases, en los centros en los que están, actuar siempre también en los centros de pensamiento, dando su opinión y también transfiriendo su conocimiento en charlas como las de hoy, que, por lo tanto, ya de entrada les agradezco la generosidad. Com sabeu, això és un diàleg, s'automoderaran, però podreu fer preguntes al final, serà una hora de diàleg i tindrem aquests 20 minuts finals per acabar a les 8. Recordeu, sempre per escrit, us les recolliran una estona abans que elles acabin i jo les traslladaré des d'aquí després. Per tant, sense més, Nathalie, Arantxa, muchas gracias y adelante.
Pues gracias. Y empezamos, pues let's start, Arantxa. I'm going to switch to English. Let's start, Arantxa, with the easy topic of war and peace. And war and peace in Europe. So Europe has often been defined, as we know, as a peace project. And indeed, Europe, and in particular, a united Europe, was what allowed us to get over many centuries of violence and destruction on this continent. And in many respects, we can see, looking at the history of European integration, that every time that Europeans tried to move into the military sphere, it didn't quite work out. Right? If we think about even before the European Union, in the 1950s, the failed project of a European defense community, initially proposed by France, but then rejected by France itself. And if we think about once we get into the late 1990s and the development of the common foreign and security policy, including a common security and defense policy, basically, that was doing the relatively easy stuff, right? I mean, it was dealing with military missions and operations in Africa, mainly in Africa, a little bit in Asia, very little in Europe. But the heavy lifting was never done by Europeans. The heavy lifting was always in the context of NATO, done by the United States. Now, here we are in a situation in which the European continent is at war. It is being threatened by Russia. And now I think it is clear to, I hope, all of us, that the war in Europe begins with Ukraine, but is not actually ending in Ukraine, right? With drone attacks and sort of fighter jets and drones basically in different European countries, from Poland to Estonia, from Denmark, all the way down to Germany. So it is very clear that this is a war that is already spreading beyond the borders of Ukraine itself. So on the one hand, there is war on the European continent. On the other hand, there is the, if one is to be very optimistic, gradual disengagement. If one is to be a little bit more pessimistic or perhaps realistic, the betrayal of the United States under Donald Trump. And so it is a Europe that is facing a Russian threat and an American betrayal. And so it is basically having to equip itself for war. Now, the question that I haven't actually resolved in my own mind is, are we actually able to do this, right? Coming back to the beginning of what I was saying, you know, this is a project that was born not just for peace and in peace, but if you think about the very evolution of the European Union, just think about the slowness. Think about the bureaucracy. Think about the complicated procedures that we have. These are all unwieldy instruments and processes that are kind of fine in peacetime. Yeah? You can afford to be slow. You can afford to be bureaucratic. And in fact, maybe if you're slow and you're bureaucratic, what you build is a fairly solid house. So, you know, I mean, there are virtues to slowness. It is not a virtue that applies in times of war. And so the question that I have to you to begin with is, can Europe actually transform its DNA into a war sort of apt basically for wartime as well?
And I think, Nathalie, that your question is a very profound one. It's not an easy question to answer. It's profound because in reality the question is, can a political community that was built to escape the logic of power? That is what the European Union was. It was a political community built to escape the logic of power relations. Can this political community learn the language of a strategic competition? Can it be equipped to fight in a world where power has become the norm? So I very much agree with you that in this question to us, we have two ingredients that we need to grapple with. The first one is, are we clear that we are in a different moment in history? Are we clear that we are in what the German Chancellor called a Zeitenwende? A move from a benign international environment to an environment driven by power. And are we Europeans clear that one of the ingredients, one of the elements on which we had built our own defense, because it's not the first time that we see war in our continent, or that we see conflicts erupting in our continent, but are we clear that the one country that was the guarantor, the ultimate guarantor of our security in Europe, is no longer the ultimate guarantor of our security? Actually, sometimes it behaves as if it was our adversary. This is the US. So have we grappled with these two big changes? My answer to this question is, to the first one, yes. We have understood that there is a change in power relations. My answer to the second one is,
Not yet.
Kind of. I see three tribes in Europe in answering this question. I see the tribe, I call them political tribes because Europe, like the rest of the world, is tribal. There is one tribe made of political parties, forces in Europe that understand that the only way forward is to integrate because we are alone. There is another tribe that wants exactly the opposite. They know that we are alone, maybe not, because they have very friendly ties to, for example, the US administration, because they have friendly ties to Russia, because they have friendly ties to China, depending on which part of this political tribe we talk about. And for them, the answer is not to integrate, it's to disintegrate.
Exactly.
It's to go back beyond the national borders, not the European borders. But there is a third tribe, and this is a problematic one for the purposes of this conversation. These are countries that are on the front line of Russia, Baltic states, Poland. When they open the window in the morning, they see the war. Actually, the drones are flying over their territory. When the Ukrainian refugees move, the first place where they move is there. And they are not convinced yet that if Russia attacks them, the rest of Europe will come to their rescue. And they are not convinced because historically, and we are all shaped by our history, they were confronted with moments in history when the other European members did not come.
Right.
they were invaded, and they were under occupation for decades. So they have trouble cutting the umbilical cord with the US because they are not yet sure that if that moment comes, Europe will behave as one, which is why, Nathalie, I think is so important what we are seeing these last weeks when drones are flying over Poland, when drones are flying over Baltic states, that the European Union member states, together with the UK, together with Norway, together with Turkey, are giving an answer.
Yeah.
Are doing this together.
Yeah.
It's almost to say, don't worry, it's not going to be like it was in the past.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I wanted to put this here, but maybe it would be important to kind of unpack what would we need to make this quantum leap.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. I mean, I think, you know, in a sense, we're in this odd situation in which actually there is one certainty. And the certainty is that if there is a Russian attack, and in some respects there already is a Russian attack, the United States will not come to the rescue, right? So that is, in a sense, a certainty. Then comes the uncertain part, right? So if we know that the United States is not going to come to the rescue, are other Europeans going to come to the rescue of European countries? And that's where, indeed, it gets tricky. Now, I think it gets tricky for different sets of reasons. And some have to do, I think, more with the changing nature of defense. Mm-hmm. And some have to do, actually, with the sphere of psychology and emotions. Mm-hmm. So I think on the former, the difficulty is that whereas once upon a time a war was tanks rolling in, and in order to avoid tanks rolling in, you have all sorts of policies of deterrence, right? And so you build certain capacities, you have certain doctrines to actually avoid war starting. Now, with the transformation of war in this hybrid, actually deterrence no longer works. We have moved from a world of deterrence to a world of resilience, right? Because the attacks are non-stop. No, it is cyber, it is sabotage, it is attacks on critical infrastructure, it is the drones, it is... And then, of course, it is all the way up to the high end and the tanks rolling in and the fighter jets and all the rest of it. But it is a far more, by definition, hybrid situation in which you don't simply have to deter, but you have to be resilient, right? So it is about a war which is actually already going on. Now, this, I think, raises a difficulty which has both to do with the capacities that we have to develop and how and whom and all the rest of it, but also because all of these attacks are happening, in some respects, below the threshold of Article 5. Yeah? And what Russia is doing is pushing the envelope. How far can we go? How far can we go? Which kind of brings me to the psychological element. And at times, I think, in Europe, so let's just assume that the US, as I said, that's a certain bit. They will not come to the rescue. In Europe, there's a weird psychological mix in which at times we are too scared, but at the same time, we're not anxious enough. What do I mean by this? So we're too scared, and our fear paralyzes us. And so we tend to interpret all of these attacks as, oh, it's not the end of the world. That also comes with the insufficient anxiety, because there can be a healthy dose of anxiety that makes you act. Yeah? In Italian, it's not the most polite expression in the world, but in Italian you say, hai il pepe al culo. No? And you can see at times we don't have enough pepe al culo, right? And we don't have enough because we're not, somehow we're in this almost delusional state in which, life was comfortable. Life was good. We don't want to accept that world has gone. Yeah, we simply want to, going back to some of your tribes, I thought you were going to say, you have your integrationists and the disintegrationists and the ones that are simply buying time. Because I think actually amongst these tribes, those are probably the most dominant, yeah? Because the ones that want to disintegrate, they have il perculo, they have a project, they're carrying it out, right? The ones that really want to integrate and have il perculo are unfortunately too few. Then there is most of us that actually don't have enough of that pepper, right? And are simply waiting for time, but we're not using that time in order to do what we're supposed, and to do what we know we should do, but we're actually not, still not doing at the speed at which we should be doing it. Which then brings me to the question of, so given these tribes, given these different, the hybrid nature of war, the easiness, the ease at which we can simply say, oh, we'll do it tomorrow, right? It's not quite war. And this weird psychological state that many of us are in, where is this action going to happen? So I have actually no doubt in my mind, I don't know about you, that we will be able to do this, right? Russia, terrible as it is, actually, here we are almost 4 years into the beginning of the war in Ukraine, and Russia has not even been able to occupy the whole of the Donbass, right? So we're not talking about some extraordinary military power here, right? And at the end of the day, here we are, as you rightly say, including the Brits, the Norwegians, around 30 of the richest countries in the world. Of course we can if we want to. But where is that action going to actually take place? And so the question that I had to you is that if you actually look at the institutions that we have, and in particular thinking about defense, there's obviously NATO and there's the European Union. Both of these organizations have a big problem. The EU we've talked about, the problem of changing a DNA. Maybe it's possible, but it's not the most obvious thing in the world. And the truth is that it's still not happened. So there's, I think, a legitimate question of if it hasn't happened up until now, maybe we can't do it. Maybe we can do some useful things on defense industry, but we can't really make that leap forward that you were suggesting. So I think there's a sort of EU problem. Then you may say, well, but there's NATO. What we can do is Europeanize NATO. If the Americans want to check out, no problem. We can use the structures as they are and Europeanize them. But you then dig a little bit deeper, and that's also very problematic, because in order for that to happen really deeply, you would have to plan it within NATO, and you would have to plan for an American betrayal. And just imagine sitting around that table with your 32 allies, including the United States, having a planning exercise on the US's betrayal of Europe. It's not going to happen. So NATO has a problem too. And I think this is fundamentally why you have had the emergence of coalitions of the willing. And so the question I have to you is, coalition of the willing, which I understand as a group of countries that shares a threat perception, shares a sense of the Russian threat, shares a sense of, hey, we've got to get this done even without the Americans, and therefore we need to get together, and the institutions that we have are, let's say, inadequate, to say the least. So we've got to do something else. But, and you've worked far more in institutions than I have, it's difficult to actually, though, get work done without institutions. It's fine for heads of state to meet now and then, and all great, Paris, London, London, Paris, Paris, London. But then if you actually want to get the work done, you need to have institutions. And so the question there, therefore, is, A, is the solution in the space of coalitions of the willing? And if so, what needs to happen to actually make these coalitions of the willing deliver the kind of defense for Europe that we're talking about?
Let me take this question, but before I take this question, take a step back in something that you said that I think is very important. Building a common security and defense is not just a question of instruments and institutions. It's a question of sharing nightmares. When you dream, you've got to dream, you have to have the same nightmares. If you don't share nightmares, there is no institution or instrument or financial fund that will substitute for the, this is a common threat that we all face. So I think this conversation has to start with a discussion about what are the threats that we face. Josep Borrell tried to do that when he worked on this idea of the strategic compass. But this cannot be a bureaucratic exercise. We live in democracies. You've got to do this and be re-elected. That's the test. Because if you do this, and you know you have to do it, but you can't be re-elected, I don't see many politicians that are very daring today to do it and risk being in power. So we've got to find a way to debate among citizens. What shared perception do we have of risks? And you've outlined a lot of these risks, the more immediate ones, the more ones that are more visible. But we've got to, in my view, extend the perimeter of the risks to cover others that people do feel are risks. Citizens feel that climate change is a risk, is a big risk. Anti-democratic forces is a risk. Right. Sorry, but fascism coming back, and it's not just a threat. We can see this in the front of our media, of our social networks. I want us to talk a little bit about social networks thereafter, but we need to have a debate among citizens in Europe about defense and security. What are the threats? What are the risks? And how can we come together to tackle them? Now, in how we come together, of course, there is the part that the Europeans know to do very well, is the economic part. So it's building a market. So frankly, today I don't see why we need 27 different standards for bullets, why we need 27 different tanks, why we need 27 different ways of defending your airspace. So we have one part that will be taken care of by how we know to do, which is the industrial part, a very important one for a country like Spain, for Catalonia. This is a very important discussion because we've got assets. And this is a conversation not only about defense and security, it's also about industrialization, competitiveness, and employment. So that part is kind of on track, and I see this is moving. The other part is obviously what's the military deployment of Europe. And there, I don't think the institutions that we have in the European Union are the institutions that will do the military deployment. We are not made for that. So what's the alternative? You've outlined one, coalitions of the willing, which is what the French president has been trying to lead on, because to do coalitions, you need leaders. Coalitions are not created out of nowhere. You need leadership. In military terms, you always need a command. In a crisis, you always need someone in command. There is no collective command in a crisis. There is the ultimate responsible one command. So how do we build that? Coalitions of the willing is what I see happening at the moment. It's very interesting because this is bringing the UK back into the discussion with the European Union. Post-Brexit, they realize that they are in the same risk zone as the EU, so they are getting together. The other way of doing, you also outlined it, is to use the structures of NATO. NATO has very well-oiled structures, and all the militaries of NATO members know to use them. They are doing joint patrolling all across Europe. actually our armies have gone to defend other countries. They've gone to defend Iraq. They've gone to defend Afghanistan. So yes, they know how to do it, but they've always been under US command.
Right.
The ultimate command in NATO, we call this in the terminology the SACEUR, is an American. And at the end of the day, he will always pick up the phone and call Washington to get his instructions. So can we, little by little, take a bit more responsibility for this? We can. But will we be urged? Maybe in the coming months, we are going to be urged to do this.
Right. Yeah.
Because the risks are not reducing, the risks are increasing. And if we are tested, we've got two options. Either we respond or we fold. And if we fold, we know what happens.
Yeah. You know, actually, just a brief point on the SACEUR point that I was actually having, but then I wanted to ask you a different question. I was having a conversation a couple of months ago with the Chris Cavoli, that was the former SACEUR, and we were having this conversation about, indeed, a European pillar in NATO, what it could mean, what it could not mean. To what extent can you really disentangle this from the US's nuclear security umbrella over Europe? And he made me, because, you know, often in this discussion in Europe, what we tend to say is, well, yes, indeed, you know, we Europeans, we should take on more responsibility on conventional defense, but ultimately the nuclear bit, that will be US. But he was explaining how actually it is very difficult to make that distinction, because many of the nuclear capacities actually rely on conventional strategic enablers. And in practice, you know, in a hypothetical sort of scenario, how it would work now is that the SACEUR, that is an American general, let's imagine a threat scenario in which actually the nuclear umbrella kind of comes in effect, would need to ask permission to the American general, which in this case is the same person. So Chris Cavoli would be asking Chris Cavoli, and Chris Cavoli would be saying yes to Chris Cavoli. But let us imagine, for the sake of argument, that these are two different people, and that one is a European, and of course the American general would always be an American general, right? Can we, the automaticity of this, and therefore the confidence of the solidity of the nuclear umbrella would also actually start shaking. So I think ultimately it would also require us to start addressing, including the nuclear question, which is why actually I think that the overtures made by Paris concerning the idea of Europeanizing, basically, the Anglo-French nuclear deterrent is actually an important one that we cannot ignore. But I wanted to come back to another point that you were making, because when you were talking about threats, you raised, I think very rightly, what I define as the reverse J.D. Vance threat. So J.D. Vance, the US Vice President, at the Munich Security Conference this year in February, attacked Europeans by saying, you know, forget about Russia. You Europeans should really worry about the threat from within. And of course, what he meant by the threat from within is the threat posed by these dangerous, woke liberals, right, that are restricting free speech and all the rest of it. Now, I think he's right on one thing. Our biggest threat is the threat from within. I would define it as the reverse J.D. Vance threat. The real threat from within is the threat of nationalist, populist, far-right movements on the rise. And so this is really what I wanted to ask you, because I think it's not only a threat in and of itself, as in a threat to democracy, but it's also a threat to security, because as you were saying, these are groups that are actually being supported both by Putin's Russia and by Trump's America. So there's a triangle of threats which are security threats and threats to democracy. Now, I think this is the picture. The question that I have in my mind, and I wanted to ask you how worried you are about this, is the ability that the far right has in, let's say, polluting the rest of the political system. I think that there was a mistake that was made, after Brexit, and after Brexit was, frankly speaking, a real disaster. All of the far-right nationalist movements in Europe abandoned the agenda of exiting the European Union. Mm-hmm. And we applauded this, saying, see, this is a sign of their moderation. They're moving towards the center. They've seen the light, yeah? Actually, I think that what has been happening is that they have smartened up. They have, in fact, not just an agenda which is just as far right, but an even more dangerous agenda in the sense that they don't only want to exit the European Union, the level of ambition is higher. They want to change the European Union from within. They want to, let's say, urbanize the European Union. And I see this project very clearly. Also because I live in a country where this is happening, right? I mean, we have a far-right government in power. And my question is actually related to this, because we're seeing it at the national level in different countries, including my own, and we're now increasingly seeing this at European level in the European Parliament. And this is really a question about the centre-right. And the way in which there is an alternative majority forming in the European Parliament, and not just in the European Parliament, as I said, in countries like my own, these are the people in government, in which you have the centre-right and the far-right in power together. And if you think about seemingly innocuous projects like simplification, I mean, a couple of days ago, there was a law passed, the first omnibus law passed in the European Parliament, under the label of simplification. Who can be against simplification, right? Who likes bureaucracy? But if you then scratch the surface, and you don't need to scratch too far because it's fairly obvious, you then realize that these are sets of, there's a law, but there's a lot jammed into it, which on the one hand seeks to deregulate Europe, particularly in areas regarding sustainability and climate. We were the big climate leader, and now we're shooting ourselves in the foot on all of this. So on the one hand, there's a rowing back on certain projects, and we're going to see the same happening. We are already seeing the same happening on digital, with the suspension of the AI Act, for example. And so this is happening under a label which, as I said, who can be against it? But actually, simplification can conceal disintegration. I mean, coming back to your tribes, right? And I don't know whether, it is clear that people on the far right are doing it because they seek disintegration. I think people on the center right, I don't know what they think, to be honest. They may be partly doing this consciously, partly doing this unconsciously. They may partly feel that this is the only way for them to retain power, not realizing that in the end they run the risk of being cannibalized by the far right. So I guess my question to you is the threat, should we understand the threat from within as being limited only to these far right parties, or should we understand that threat from within as having to do with the ability of these far-right groups in, let's say, putting out their tentacles across the political system?
Let me first say that I do think that the manner in which we have regulated the Green Deal or technology has led to an excessive level of bureaucracy that, in my view, is good correcting. So I do agree with the idea of simplifying. I talk to companies very often, many small companies that have to do incredibly complex reporting on what they do, how they source, from where they buy, the due diligence in their value chains, that can be simplified if we did regulation with a sense of horizontal as opposed to vertical. The way we do regulation in Europe is every commissioner has his own little fiefdom, but the problems a company has to manage are horizontal. They are all the fiefdoms together. So let me say that I would wholeheartedly agree with the agenda on simplifying, but I also see the danger of using the simplification to move into a deregulation. And more than that is to bring a questioning to, in the end, what is Article 1 and Article 2 and Article 3 of the treaty. And this is where I want to put the answer to your question. We have a problem, every democracy in Europe has a problem to deal with political forces that today are questioning Article 1, 2, and 3 of the Treaty on the European Union. Actually, they also question their own constitutions. Now, democracies are extremely generous with those that question democracies. This is the beauty of democracies, and it bears repeating it in this country today, 20th of November. Our democracies are very big. They are a big tent. They are generous because they fit within those that question those democracies. Article 1 of the EU Treaty, I read this all the time because it is our guiding star. It says, the EU is founded on human dignity. How much human dignity do we see in many of these political forces that are clearly racist in many instances? Right. It's built on freedom, it's built on democracy, it's built on equality. Actually, it says equality between men and women. So it's not, and how many political forces do we see in Europe today that are questioning this? So we have a problem with these political forces. Now, we are democracies, so we juggle with, we don't expel those political forces, although they question the very fundamentals on which is built our political project, but we work to see how to manage the force that they represent, because they represent also a political force. And we haven't found a good recipe.
No, well, we found a bad recipe.
Well, we found a recipe of emulating them.
Exactly.
Okay? So questioning the values on which we are founded.
Yeah.
And it's not a small thing, but we have to say it. I want to repeat, it's not a small thing, but we have to say it. So, one part of the recipe is basically to say, okay, if you cannot win, just join them. Become similar to them. Emulate. And it's becoming very tough in some areas, which are clearly in contradiction with our values. It is clearly the case with refugees.
Right.
It's clearly the case with asylum seekers. It's clearly the case with migration policies. It's clearly the case with equality between men and women. It's clearly the case with sustainability, which is Article 3. It's not Article 1 or 2, it's Article 3, but it's still Article 3. So how can we deal with these political forces and the citizens who are behind those political forces? Because these political forces exist because there are citizens that are behind them. So I've seen joining them, emulating them, which is what I've seen in a number of conservative governments that move from being conservative, and in saying this, I'm not judging, I'm just simply describing. They move little by little to try and occupy this space. The other model is, which we have also seen, is to say no. To say no. But this model is having a little bit of a difficulty within the European Union today.
Yeah, I mean, it is, although let me make the case for saying no. because I think, we somehow tend to conflate these parties exist, we can't pretend that they don't exist, and we are a big tent, and we have to keep them in. And that's all correct, I think. But another is to imply from that given that they exist, I necessarily have to work with them. Well, no. I mean, if we don't share the same values, if we don't share the same principles, I will not form a coalition government with you, right? So there is nothing in democracy that obliges me to form a coalition government with you. And if you can't get a majority, even if you are the first party, but if you can't get a majority, well, tough luck, right? So I'm not being anti-democratic by refusing to work with you.
Very clearly.
And I think that there has been, and there is a growing confusion in this respect. And, what really worries me, coming back to this alternative majority, which is forming, it is forming on the three things that we've talked about. On rowing back on climate and sustainability. And yes, you're right, there are some things that could change, but we're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. It is happening on digital, and it is happening on migration and asylum. And actually, if you think that coming back to defense, that the real defense thing is in any case really happening at national level, what is left for the European Union to do is to pursue a disintegration agenda on these three fronts. Which is which then kind of brings me to a third block of things that I think would be important to discuss, which is the way in which we're then looked at and perceived by the rest of the world, right? Because here we are in a Europe which, okay, fine, I think it's understandable. And if you go to countries in the so-called global south, they understand that Ukraine is our first priority. What they don't understand is that Ukraine is our only priority. And what they don't understand is that we're actually, once we used to present ourselves as climate leaders, once we used to present ourselves as defenders of international humanitarian law, and now we are moving back from all of this. And so I think there's a real risk, which is as we succumb to a threat from within, there is also a risk of losing the rest of the world.
It's true. In international relations, for those of us who've worked in international affairs, and you like me, we've done a fair amount of work in this space, we know very well that the world is full of double standards, that there is no single country today that is not, in some way or another, double standard. But it's true that we made our values Article 1 of our treaty. And Article 1 says that we will pursue those values as founding values of the Europeans, but that we will project those values also outside our borders. And this is why today others held us to account with tougher standards than they do to other nations around the world that are equally practicing double standards. And if we look at the situation in Gaza, or if I look at the situation in Sudan, which is horrendous today, there are many others than the European Union that have been terribly double standard, but they never pretended to have standards in the first place. So, of course, we are suffering. Our reputation is suffering, our credibility is suffering, as a result of which our power is suffering. All of this is also power, right? And what worries me, Nathalie, is that a big part of our power is our ability to relate to other countries. A big part of our power is our capacity to build partnerships with others. That we are in a better position because we are more open as an economy than other parts of the world. We can build coalitions with others because we care in reality, about things that others care about. Climate, reducing poverty around the world, defending human rights. We have an ability to build more partnerships with others. And you know, the world today, and this is also something different from the world when the European Union was created, is that it has many more countries with agency, with power. Right. So in a way, our power also depends on our capacity to remain connected to all these countries that represent power. Together we can get... Take this week. There is a G20 taking place in South Africa. It's the first ever G20 that takes place in the African continent. There will be no US representative in this meeting. At all, exactly. At all. But there will not be the leaders of China either. Right. There will not be the leaders of Saudi Arabia either. But who will be there? The leaders of the European Union. So we have this opportunity, not only this capacity, we have this opportunity, but we have to come to terms, maybe be a bit more humble, eat a bit of humble pie. Humbleness is, by the way, a value that we don't practice a lot in international affairs, and I think it is very necessary. So a bit more humbleness and a bit more toughness is maybe the recipe that we could try to exit this corner in which we have put ourselves. We keep putting ourselves with our own internal contradictions.
You know, I mean, I think you raised this really important point about double standards, and double standards, in a sense, presupposing that there are standards. And so would we rather have double standards, or would we rather have perfect coherence with no standards at all, right? So I think that's a really important point that is really worth underlying. Now, I do think that although double standards to an extent will probably always be a fact of life, and I think it has to do with humility and maybe a little bit with honesty as well. I think it would be an easier conversation if we recognize them. And, you know, this kind of reminds me of a conversation that I had in Indonesia a few months ago, and it was in Bandung, and it was a conference that the Indonesians were organizing 70 years after the Bandung conference. And it was all about, you know, making the Bandung principles and the Bandung spirit relived. I mean, for those that are less familiar, basically this was really the beginning of when, during the Cold War, this coalesced into the non-aligned movement. And what was really interesting about those principles and that spirit is that it was principled. It was not transactional at all. It was, if you read the 10 Bandung principles, you could literally sign off on them, you know, today. It's all about human rights and self-determination, and, you know. So having that conversation with them, and it was a group of, you know, people from the global south and a few Europeans, not many, but a few Europeans, there was a moment in which, you know, I think it was a colleague from Pakistan, and he said, you know, we from the global south, and of course, you know, they have friendly relations with Russia, we have to learn to criticize our friends. It's easy to criticize our adversaries, right? The difficult bit is to criticize your friends, to, you know, maybe even sanction your friends if they commit crimes. So I think it would be a much easier conversation if we take Ukraine, Gaza, right? It would be a much easier conversation for us to have with them on Ukraine if we had a more honest conversation about our double standards on Gaza with them, yeah? And if we recognize that they also have double standards, we have double standards, but if what we're trying to do, and this is, I think, a trap that we risk falling into, thinking, well, it's all transactional now. It's not principled at all. And I believe that we're not very good at doing the transactional thing. I mean, there's a certain clumsiness in the way in which we try and be transactional. I mean, take an example like the Global Gateway. This was supposed to be the ultimate transactional instrument of the European Union. You then see the implementation, and of course the rules and the regulations of this and that are still there, right? And so you raise an expectation of kind of being big, bad, and ugly, but then in practice you end up being more or less, a kind of worse version of yourself. So I think, firstly, I would say, let's be wary of transactionism. But I think if we then, actually think about how do we develop maybe pragmatic but principled partnerships with many of these countries in the Global South, and, look at, in some areas, actually we're not doing too badly. I think trade is one of them. This has been an area in which actually we are at least trying to accelerate a trade agenda. In other areas, I think we have not seized the, let's call them opportunities left by the voids filled by others. I think development is actually such an area. Fine, the US is, well, not fine, but the US is stepping out. Shouldn't we be stepping in and filling those voids rather than allowing others to fill that void? So I think there's some areas of kind of risk of a missed opportunity. And then there are other areas, coming back to climate, in which we are still, if you actually look at, objectively, we are still the climate leaders. But the way in which we are, on the one hand, rowing back, and comes back to the earlier conversation, and also disowning this dossier. And it is actually enabling China to look much better than what it actually is. If you actually look at at China's targets, you take China's decarbonization targets, they're not very ambitious at all. They're not very ambitious. Ours are obviously still way more ambitious. But if our level of ambition in relative terms goes down, and if their performance, if they outperform their low ambitions, they look great. We look terrible, right? And so, again, this is an area where actually we are still there, but we're completely unable to basically sell ourselves, right?
So I want to, I said that I wanted to touch on technology and artificial intelligence. And I want to link this to this conversation because I think it matters a lot. Where are we discussing all these issues? What's the public space where we are discussing and debating all of this together? What is this space? What's the public agora? The public agora is not our public agora.
Right.
The public agora is 3 men.
With an agenda.
X, TikTok, the new TikTok, and the Instagram conglomerate. These are the 3 men shaping our public square. There where we are having these conversations. And what do these 3 men have in common? They don't want responsibilities, and they don't want limitation of power. And what have we done? We, in Europe, have been a bit courageous because we've put limits. We've said, no, okay, you want to be the intermediator of this, the builder of this public agora, you have responsibilities. We've put this in the regulation of AI. We want to know how these algorithms are built, because these algorithms today are built to produce polarization.
Of course.
They sell extremes, and therefore they accelerate that we all see extremes. And we think we live in an extreme, but maybe not. But we don't know. So Europe has decided, and it's a tough choice, to put limits to the power by having a bit of a say on how these algorithms are built and work, opening the black box of algorithms. also by limiting by putting some responsibility into those that run those systems. And it was kind of going in that direction, but it is now also under attack.
Right.
But let's be very clear what this is. Let's be very clear what this is. And let's be very clear of the consequences. It's not just some crazy guy in Brussels doing regulatory frameworks on artificial intelligence. It's our public agora. It's how we debate with ourselves on all those things that we care about. On sustainability, on equality, on migration, on humanity, on democracy. That is the challenge that we have. I wanted to put this on the table, Nathalie, as an example of how big our problem is collectively in building this space where we will debate these very profound issues as citizens with agency in our democracies, but also to introduce this notion that I would like to be also a bit of our message tonight, which is that we have agency. This regulatory framework is the result of we deciding that we want to do this.
Right.
And doing it.
Right.
And many countries around the world following what we have done because they see the same problem in their own societies. So when we want to do something, we've got the power to do it.
Exactly. When we want something, we have the power to do it. And when we want, but we also have the power to undo it. And I think that this is, I think, the AI Act is actually a wonderful example. So is this or was this a perfect act? Obviously not, yeah? I was the first. No one else had it, right? So by definition, it cannot have been perfect. By definition, it was going to be work in progress because the technology changes. So by definition, it was going to be, in many respects, living document. But to then assume that our problem and the reason why we don't have big tech companies is because we overregulate is, frankly speaking, total bullshit, right? Total bullshit. Our primacy, we never had primacy in technology, but let's say our relative primacy in technology has been going down for decades. Years before, forget AI Act, but years before the GDPR, years before the Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, it doesn't have to do with regulation. There are all sorts of other reasons which have to do with the lack of integration, why we have not actually done what we are supposed to be doing, because we don't have a capital markets union, because, there are all sorts of reasons. So, again, I don't wish to say simplification is bad, simplification is good, but we are, there are outside forces that are pushing us in this direction. And, in a sense, by moving in this direction, through the agency that we still do have, we risk undoing. So I think, in a sense, in many respects, the bottom line in all of this is, firstly, let's not lose sight of the good things that we've done. We have done good things when it comes to climate. We have done good things when it comes to technology. We do have, and in many other areas, right? We do have the ability to move forward. Yes, do we have to change, defense, this and that and the other, but we have proved that we have been able to do it. But we're also beginning to prove that we're able to undo it. So let's also remember how fragile this Europe that we've built is, yeah? And that the fact that it's been around for the last 8 decades does not mean that it will be around for the next 8, unless we not only take good care of it, but actually use that agency to move forward.
On this, shall we open the floor to the room?
Tenemos 20 minutos porque a las 8 Nathalie tiene que ir pitando al aeropuerto. Pero aprovechamos, Nathalie y Arantxa, hay bastantes preguntas. La primera, ¿por qué no se expulsa a los países que intentan disgregar Europa? Y en concreto hay otra que nos dice sobre el papel de Orbán. No se tendría que haber aplicado, por ejemplo, el artículo 7 y se ha mandado un mal mensaje no aplicándolo.
Pues evidentemente sí. ¿Por qué no se ha hecho eso? Yo creo que hay dos motivos, perdona por mi español, que es un poco así, pero bueno. Dos motivos por qué eso no se ha hecho. El primero es que la radicalización de Orbán fue algo de incremental. ¿Qué quiero decir? Nosotros vemos a Orbán hoy, es tan evidente que es un extremista, que es radical, que es iliberal, que es antidemocrático, que es todo eso. Pero Orbán era un liberal. Orbán estaba financiado para George Soros, ¿no? Orbán, cuando lo eligieron por la primera vez, no era el Orbán de hoy. Fue una transformación pues muy lenta, paso a paso. Y lo que pasa, y yo creo que los fascistas inteligentes, en esta categoría pongo también mi primera ministra, no hacen el cambio muy de repente de un día al otro, lo hacen paso a paso, así que no te das cuenta y después cuando te das cuenta es demasiado tarde. Y hay después el segundo motivo, demasiado tarde, ¿qué quiere decir? Demasiado tarde quiere decir que hoy, no es solamente un problema de Orbán, porque hay Orbán en Hungría, hay Meloni en Italia, hay Babiš en la República Checa, pues en Polonia había el PiS, ahora hay un presidente que vuelve del PiS, el gobierno no es, pero bueno, hay una urbanización de Europa. A lo mejor Orbán y la Eslovaquia son los más radicales, y Fico son los más radicales, seguro los más prorrusos. Pero hay otros pequeños y grandes orbanines que están alrededor que no tienen un interés a activar el artículo 7, porque si lo activas por la Hungría, a lo mejor lo puedes activar un día también por la Polonia, por la República Checa, por la Eslovaquia, por la Italia, por la Austria. Y así esta urbanización de la Europa, ¿no? Eso vuelve a la amenaza, ¿no? Adentro. Fue una amenaza que se fue pues, desarrollando poco a poco en los años, ¿no?
Yo quiero pensar también en todos estos ciudadanos húngaros, todos ciudadanos eslovacos, todos estos ciudadanos polacos que se pelean todos los días para defender su democracia. Yo quiero pensar también en ellos. ¿Qué hacemos con ellos? ¿Los mandamos al exilio? ¿Los sacamos de la Unión Europea, sacando a sus países de la Unión Europea? ¿O les ayudamos a que ellos venzan en su batalla? También hay que pensar en esos ciudadanos. Ellos también están peleándose. ¿Qué hacemos cuando Hungría cambie de gobierno? ¿Vamos a declarar que ha ganado la democracia y le hemos vencido? Esto es una guerra, esto es una lucha, no lo quiero llamar guerra porque esto no es una guerra. Es una lucha que nosotros tenemos dentro de las democracias. Y lo que a mí me gustaría es que también prestásemos un poquito de atención a cuál es la raíz de ese conflicto que tenemos en muchas de nuestras democracias, que ahora algunas las llamamos con este nombre un poco pomposo de democracias iliberales, que parece un poco un contrasentido, ¿no? Pero ¿cómo hemos llegado ahí? También tenemos que preguntarnos esa cuestión. ¿Por qué hay ciudadanos que se sienten más cómodos bajo el ala protectora de este tipo de liderazgo? Esto también tenemos que preguntárnoslo, porque no es que la gente se haya vuelto loca. Buscan algo, ¿no? ¿Qué buscan? Bueno, pues buscan protección, buscan seguridad, buscan tranquilidad, buscan progreso y ellos se lo prometen. Entonces quizás tenemos que pelearnos también en demostrar que se puede garantizar progreso, que se puede garantizar seguridad, que se puede garantizar mejorar tus perspectivas vitales, y se puede hacer defendiendo profundamente la democracia, con equilibrio de poderes, con respeto a los derechos y las libertades individuales, con respecto a la igualdad de género, descarbonizando nuestras economías. Todo eso es lo que también tenemos que... Porque si no, la vía de saquemos o metamos, eso es un poco fácil, me parece a mí, ¿no? Peleémonos por lo que queremos representar las democracias, que es también el ser capaces de transformar nuestras sociedades.
Nos dicen, mientras las tribus europeas se miran su ombligo, otras potencias se organizan y crecen. Dicen, ante las bravuconadas de Trump, China exhibe músculo en su último desfile militar, acompañado de Putin, Kim Jong-un, lo que sea. Nos dicen, puede ser que nuestro occidente agonice mientras despiertan los dragones asiáticos y el león africano. Podemos, en este contexto de Europa, ¿qué puede hacer para ser útil? Y hay otra que, ligada con esta, nos dice, ¿qué papel quiere Trump para Europa? ¿Qué papel quiere China para Europa? Y cómo lo que ellos quieren no tiene que coincidir con lo que nosotros queremos. Pero ¿cuál ahora es el juego?
Lo que creo que está muy claro es que pues, no vivimos en un mundo unipolar donde hay una hegemonía de los Estados Unidos. Eso ya pasó. Lo que está menos claro es el mundo en que vivimos. En el sentido que hay, creo, dos modelos, y cada escenario, para definición, es una simplificación, pero vamos, dos modelos posibles. Hay un modelo que es un mundo de imperios. Imperios se dice.
Imperios.
Imperios. Hay un imperio americano, hay un imperio chino, hay un imperio ruso. Por imperio lo que quiero decir es un mundo donde no hay reglas, es un mundo del survival of the fittest, un mundo darwiniano. Donde los principios de soberanía, de integridad territorial, no hablo de derechos humanos, el básico del derecho internacional, soberanía, integridad territorial, de los grandes, pero también de los pequeños, eso ya nada. Así que tenemos Estados Unidos, que a lo mejor quiere anexionar la Groenlandia, a lo mejor el México, Canadá y tal, la Rusia que quiere su esfera de influencia en la Europa del Este y también la China que tiene sus ambiciones en el este asiático a partir de salir de Taiwán. Bueno, eso es un modelo. En este modelo nosotros europeos, nosotros somos colonias, colonias americanas, colonia rusa, pero somos colonia. Después hay un segundo modelo que la gente le llama un mundo multipolar. Hay polos distintos. La ambición sería que a lo mejor las normas, las reglas, las leyes que unen estos polos, a lo mejor no son tan, ¿cómo decir?, thick, tan consistentes como las reglas que había en lo que se llaman el orden liberal internacional. A lo mejor son un poco más finas, pero ideas como la soberanía, la integridad territorial siguen siendo el básico, ¿no? Cuando antes hablaba de la importancia de crear unos partenariados de principios también, no solamente de transacción con los países del Global South, me refería un poco a eso. En este mundo, claro, la condición necesaria es una Europa unida, porque si no, eso no va a pasar. Lo que quieren Trump y China, lo que quiere Trump de la Europa es bastante claro, porque lo dice él, la Unión Europea está creada para joder los Estados Unidos. ¿Y qué quiere decir? Está bastante claro, pero ¿por qué? lo dice Trump. Porque en su cabeza tiene razón. Está claro que una Europa unida no es una Europa que se puede colonizar, ¿no? Una Europa unida es una Europa con la cual hay que hacer a lo mejor un deal, pues un deal donde hay un dar y un recibir. No es un deal que no es un deal, más extracción, se dice.
¿Sí?
Bueno, así que lo que quiere Trump es bastante claro. Lo que quiere la China es un poco más ambiguo, porque los chinos son un poco más ambiguos. Seguro que no quieren una Europa fuerte. Eso creo que no. Está claro que tienen sus objetivos estratégicos, su economic statecraft, y que en Europa tienen proyectos estratégicos económicos. Eso también creo que es bastante claro. No creo que tiene ambición territorial en Europa, no es la Rusia en este sentido, a lo mejor no es los Estados Unidos. Y creo que con la China la verdad es que es importante ver si es posible, aunque no son amigos, no nos quieren, pero están en una otra región. Creo que al margen, doy solamente un ejemplo. Ahora la China, como sabemos, es muy cerca de la Rusia, compra el petróleo ruso, ayuda a la Rusia, por ejemplo, exportando capacidades dual use, tecnológicas que se pueden utilizar en el ámbito de la defensa. Bueno, yo no creo que es realístico pensar que la Europa puede convencer a la China de dejar a los rusos y de no sé, comprar petróleo ruso. Eso no creo que es posible. Pero sí que creo que es posible a lo mejor convencer a los chinos a evitar de exportar productos dual use. Pero claro, los chinos nos dicen, pero vosotros ¿qué nos das en cambio? Y nosotros no podemos pensar de estar contra la China, contra la Rusia, contra los Estados Unidos. Tenemos también, ¿no? Sí, tenemos un poco agency y todo eso, pero también hay unos límites del poder que tenemos. Así que yo creo que con la China ahora estamos demasiado en un mindset de ver cómo es justo, China, Rusia, todo uno, y así que China es el enemigo. Yo creo que con Beijing es importante, en todo que se habla de política exterior y de defensa, que se habla de clima, que se habla de tecnología, de comercio, ver dónde se puede dar, dónde se puede recibir, ¿no? Cómo se puede tratar.
Bueno, yo creo que hablamos de imperios, pero a mí me parecen casi más emporios, ¿no? Emporios de individuos que lo que quieren es beneficiarse. O sea que quizás estamos en un momento de transición, y en este momento de transición, y teniendo como tenemos el Ágora Pública, que es donde debatimos de esto, que está muy mediatizada, y igual no nos está dando una imagen de lo que está ocurriendo en el mundo. Pero miremos un poco qué ha ocurrido en estos últimos meses. Hemos visto a Estados Unidos que ha querido romper el sistema comercial internacional. ¿Y qué ha ocurrido? Que Estados Unidos se ha salido del sistema comercial multilateral, pero el resto de los países no lo han hecho. Y Estados Unidos representa el 13% del comercio internacional. El resto, el 87% restante, ha decidido que esto no le convenía y no ha seguido por esa vía. Es más, en estos últimos días, Estados Unidos también ha tenido que dar un poquito de marcha atrás porque resulta que ha descubierto algo que ya le habíamos dicho muchas veces antes, que es que los aranceles son impuestos y que generan inflación. Y entonces ahora tenemos que echar para atrás. Digo esto porque a veces nos puede parecer que está realmente cambiando el sistema. ¿Pero está realmente cambiando el sistema? No. Yo creo que hay un cuestionamiento del sistema. Creo que Estados Unidos está cuestionando de una manera muy clara el sistema de cooperación internacional. Pero a la vez que lo hace, se encuentra también con una realidad muy tozuda, que es una economía y una sociedad muy interdependiente.
Sí.
Y que deshacer esa interdependencia cuesta mucho. Y que cuando llega a tocarle el bolsillo hay que replantearse las cosas. Que hay que mirar con atención. Hay que mirar con atención lo que está ocurriendo en el tema del dólar. Y la supremacía del dólar, que es una de las fuerzas de Estados Unidos. De hecho, nosotros compramos nuestra energía en dólares, a pesar de tener el euro. Esta moneda está sufriendo de la erraticidad política, pero también hay un proyecto detrás. Construir una moneda digital en manos privadas, pero con la garantía del Tesoro americano. Miremos con atención a esto. ¿Qué está haciendo China? Yo creo que China está haciendo lo que ha hecho siempre, mirar por sus intereses. ¿Y cuáles son sus intereses? Que en el mundo haya una cierta estabilidad. Sí. A China no le va bien que haya una inestabilidad, porque tiene muchas dificultades para gestionar su interno. Sí. Y si además de gestionar su interno tiene que gestionar un entorno internacional complicado, es muy difícil. Esto es exactamente lo opuesto de Rusia, sí, que le gusta el lío internacional. Claro. Porque así eso es una manera de existir en un mundo donde desde un punto de vista económico, la economía rusa es una economía muy pequeña. ¿Qué hace Europa en todo esto? Primero, tener claro que tiene la capacidad de decidir lo que será en el futuro, que no lo ha escrito nadie todavía, que no hay determinismo, que no porque el Financial Times diga que ahora Europa se ha terminado Europa, que Europa será lo que nosotros queremos que sea. Y decidir de una vez qué queremos nosotros que sea. Eso es la respuesta. No hay otra. Y esa respuesta se la tenemos que dar nosotros, todos nosotros. Y no nos tiene que quitar nadie el poder de tomar esa decisión que nos pertenece a nosotros.
Eso sí.
Nos quedan 5 minutos, pero lanzo algunas más. Hay un pack de 3 que tienen que ver con Ucrania y la guerra. Ahora hay unas negociaciones en las que no ha sido invitada a Europa. Parece que se puede estar tratando pues, por que haya una cesión territorial a cambio de un alto el fuego, etc. Exactamente cuál tendría que ser el papel de Europa o cuál puede ser si no se la invita, ¿no? ¿Dónde está Europa en estos momentos? Ahí. Y relacionada con esta y otra que nos dice si no aumentar el gasto militar en Europa puede ponernos en riesgo. Hay muchos partidos políticos, mucha gente que está en contra de aumentar el gasto militar. Aparentemente mucha gente podría estar de acuerdo, pero nos dicen, bueno, ¿y si esto al final lo que nos lleva es a una situación de riesgo para Europa? ¿Estamos ahí? Estas dos que irían un poco juntas. Muy breve y así.
Sí. Hago yo Ucrania y tú...
Venga.
Tú militar. Ok, así que... pues vuelve al discurso de, ¿no? Hay la ilusión y hay la realidad. Hay la ilusión que si Trump habla con Putin, si los rusos y los americanos negocian, la capitulación de Ucrania es cosa hecha. Y que los europeos que estaban sosteniendo la Ucrania se quedan así, no sé cómo se dice en español, en italiano decimos con el cerino en mano, con la vela encendida en la mano. Bueno, en realidad lo que está pasando, sí, hay discusiones entre rusos y americanos. Estos 28 puntos de este plan es una capitulación de Ucrania, pero de aquella a pensar que este plan será implementado es una fantasía. Es una fantasía. Y la cosa bastante increíble de todo eso es que desde que Trump llegó y paró las ayudas americanas a los ucranianos, porque ahora lo que pasa es que los americanos venden armas a los ucranianos que pagamos nosotros. Así que los americanos, la verdad es que no tienen las mismas levas, se dice, en frente de los ucranianos o de los europeos. El paradoxo de todo esto es que en el tentativo de Trump de poner aparte los europeos tienen mucha más influencia en Ucrania que la tenían cuando había Biden. Así que, y en todo eso, ¿por qué la Ucrania va a aceptar la capitulación cuando después de 4 años los rusos no han conseguido obtener las mismas cosas militarmente? Así que los ucranianos van a decir no. Sí, es eso. Yo al final creo que todo esto tiene más a ver con leaks que son determinados para tensiones al interno de la administración Trump, porque hay una parte más nacionalista, nacionalista vanciana y una parte más neocon de Marco Rubio. Bueno, pero eso es otra conversación, sí. Así que yo creo que todo eso a lo mejor no va a acabar en nada, pero aunque va a acabar en un plan ruso-americano, no quiere decir que la guerra se separa, porque los ucranianos no van a capitular.
Arantxa, antes no empieces. 2 minutos y un avión.
Telegráficamente, tenemos que cambiar la manera en la que gastamos para nuestra defensa, para nuestra seguridad, sí. ¿Hay que gastar más? Sí. ¿Hay que gastar el 5%? No estoy convencida. No. ¿Hay que gastar mejor? Sí. No hay que tener 17 tipos de tanques, ni 20 estándares de balas. Hay que hacer el gasto de manera más eficiente, porque todos tenemos los bolsillos muy pequeños. Incluso Alemania, que es el que los tiene más grandes, los tiene pequeños. Y también hay que gastar más en europeo. Yo si pudiera, creo que sería, si fuera posible, creo que sería muy bueno un fondo de inversión europeo con deuda pública europea para hacer gasto militar europeo. Esto nos ayudaría también a soñar o a tener las mismas pesadillas cuando tenemos que pagarlo todo del mismo bolsillo.
Havia més preguntes, us sap greu no haver pogut fer-les totes, unes sobre multilateralisme, el paper de la ONU, varias cosas, pero nos tenemos que quedar aquí. Nathalie, Arantxa, ha sido un placer. Muchas gracias por vuestras reflexiones. Os invitaremos otro día.